A thug drags a girl by her hair on the street, and what happens next defies belief. The heavily tattooed enforcer violently yanks the college student toward a black SUV while terrified bystanders freeze in horror. But the older man walking down the Brooklyn sidewalk isn't just another witness. This is Mike Tyson himself. The street punk has no idea he just committed assault in front of a man who spent decades destroying opponents with his bare hands. While the thug slaps the helpless girl and laughs at the gathering crowd, the former heavyweight champion approaches with that legendary cold stare that once terrorized the boxing world. The enforcer's crew thinks they're about to intimidate another scared civilian, but they're actually watching their boss pick a fight with pure devastation in human form. The girl recognizes her savior first, hope flashing in her terrified eyes as Iron Mike closes the distance. What happens when a street thug meets a living legend? Can the enforcer survive learning why some champions never fade? What happened next would haunt the punk's nightmares for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Mike Tyson's modest Brooklyn apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. At 58, the former heavyweight champion of the world still woke at dawn, just as he had during his fighting days. Old habits died hard, especially the good ones. Mike sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped together, eyes closed in quiet meditation. The apartment was simple, no fancy furniture or flashy decorations. A few championship belts hung on one wall, mixed with family photos and books about philosophy and redemption. This wasn't the home of a man trying to impress anyone. This was the home of a man who had found peace after 20 minutes of prayer. In reflection, Mike stood and dressed in his usual attire: dark jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. He grabbed his keys and wallet, then stepped out into the Brooklyn morning. Atlantic Avenue was already alive with the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Mike walked with purpose toward Eddie's bodega, his regular morning destination. His presence on the street was both commanding and comforting. People recognized the legend, but more importantly, they knew him as a neighbor who cared about their community. "Morning, champ," Giuseppe Moretti called out as Mike entered the small store. The 74-year-old owner had been running this bodega for over 30 years, watching the neighborhood change around him. His thick, white mustache bounced as he smiled, but Mike noticed the worry lines around his eyes had deepened lately. "Morning, Giuseppe." "The usual," Mike replied, grabbing a bottle of orange juice and a banana from the counter. "You see the news last night?" Giuseppe asked, shaking his head. "2 more break-ins on Prospect Street. Mrs. Chin's flower shop got hit again." Before Mike could respond, the bell above the door chimed. Mrs. Eleanor Washington entered, her 82-year-old frame moving slowly but with dignity. Despite her age, she carried herself like a woman who had seen plenty of trouble and wasn't about to back down from more. "Good morning, Mike," she said warmly. "Giuseppe's right to be worried. These young punks think they can terrorize whoever they want. Nobody seems safe anymore." Mike paid for his items, listening carefully. "How bad has it gotten?" "Bad enough that I don't let my granddaughter walk home from school alone," Mrs. Washington replied. "There's been strange men in black cars circling the block, watching, waiting for something." The door chimed again, and 16-year-old Tommy Rodriguez bounded in, his energy a sharp contrast to the worried adults. "Hey, Mr. Tyson, you still coming to the community center today?" "Wouldn't miss it," Mike said, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Tommy was a good kid, smart, respectful, ambitious. The kind of young man the neighborhood needed more of. "Can you show me that uppercut technique you mentioned last week?" Tommy asked, shadowboxing playfully. "Keep your grades up first," Mike said with a slight smile. "Strong mind, strong body." As he left the bodega, Mike walked slowly down Atlantic Avenue, taking in everything around him. Too many storefronts were boarded up. Too much graffiti marked territory that used to be safe. Too many residents looked over their shoulders when they walked. This wasn't the Brooklyn he remembered. This wasn't the neighborhood where good people should have to live in fear. Mike turned onto Prospect Avenue, heading toward the community center where he volunteered as a boxing coach twice a week. It was 8:45 a.m., and he was right on schedule. But something caught his attention: a black SUV with tinted windows parked outside the Paradise Cafe, engine running. The vehicle looked out of place. Expensive. Dangerous. Mike made a mental note as he continued walking. In his experience, when something felt wrong, it usually was 0.2 minutes later. Mike was half a block from the community center when a woman's scream pierced the morning air behind him. He spun around immediately, his old fighter's instincts flaring to life. The sound had come from near the Paradise Cafe, right where that black SUV was parked. What Mike saw made his blood run cold that a massive man with heavily tattooed arms was dragging a young woman by her long black hair across the sidewalk. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, dressed in jeans and a college sweatshirt, her textbooks scattered across the pavement where she dropped them. "Stop fighting me, you little bitch," the man snarled, yanking her toward the waiting SUV. He was big, maybe 6'1", 220 pounds, with the kind of muscle that came from a gym and a steroid bottle. The girl clawed desperately at his hands, trying to break free. "Let me go? Help. Somebody help me." But nobody helped. An elderly man with a cane started to step forward, then saw the size of the attacker and quickly looked away. A woman with a baby stroller crossed to the other side of the street. Other pedestrians suddenly found reasons to walk faster in the opposite direction. Mike understood their fear. The tattooed man radiated violence like heat from a furnace. Prison tattoos covered his arms, Russian symbols mixed with gang markings. This wasn't some random thug. This was a professional. "Please," the girl begged, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't see anything. I swear I didn't see anything." The enforcer backhanded her across the face, the sharp sound echoing off the building walls. "Shut up. You should have minded your own business." The girl stumbled but kept fighting, her courage impressive even in terror. She was small, maybe 5'6", but she wasn't going down without a battle. That's when Mike saw the SUV's other occupants. Two more men sat waiting, windows down, watching the street like predators. One had his hand resting on something in his lap, probably a gun. This wasn't a random crime. This was organized, professional, the kind of operation that required planning and backup. Mike dropped his gym bag on the sidewalk and started walking toward the confrontation. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wasn't rushing. Rushing led to mistakes. But he wasn't hesitating either. The big man noticed him approaching and laughed, still gripping the girl's hair. "Keep walking, old man, unless you want some too." Mike continued forward without breaking stride. His hands hung loose at his sides, but his body was already shifting into the stance that had made him the most feared fighter of his generation. "Let the girl go," Mike said quietly. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from 30 years of backing up his words with action. The enforcer studied Mike's face for the first time, trying to decide if this gray-haired stranger was worth worrying about. He saw an older man in simple clothes, someone who should know better than to get involved in other people's business. He had no idea he was staring at one of the most dangerous men who ever lived. "You got 3 seconds to walk away, Grandpa," the thug said, releasing the girl's hair and turning to face Mike directly. "After that, you're going to need an ambulance." Mike's expression didn't change. His dark eyes remained focused and calm, the way they used to look right before he destroyed someone in the ring. The girl, free for a moment, scrambled backward toward a parked car, smart enough to get out of the way but too frightened to run. "Last warning, old man," the enforcer said, pulling a telescoping baton from his jacket. Mike's response was simple and terrifying. He smiled. The enforcer never saw it coming. Mike Tyson had built his reputation on speed, the ability to end fights before his opponents realized they had started. Age hadn't changed that. If anything, it had refined it. The moment the thug extended the baton, Mike moved. His signature uppercut caught Dean Kowalski square on the point of his jaw with the force of a sledgehammer. Kowalski's feet actually left the ground, his 220-pound frame lifting 3 inches into the air before crashing backward into a parked Honda. The baton clattered uselessly to the sidewalk. Kowalski slumped unconscious against the car's dented door, blood trickling from his mouth. The entire exchange had lasted less than 2 seconds. The SUV's driver, Pete Novak, jumped out with a 9mm pistol already in his hand. "You're dead, old man." But Mike was already moving, using Kowalski's fallen body as cover. He rolled left, came up behind a parked delivery truck, and circled back while Novak tried to track him. Mike emerged from Novak's blind spot like a ghost, his left hook connected, with Novak's temple before the gunman could turn around. The pistol flew from Novak's hand, skittering across the pavement as he crashed through the Paradise Cafe's front window in an explosion of glass and screaming customers. The SUV's third occupant, Jimmy Torres, panicked. He scrambled over the center console into the driver's seat, trying to escape before this nightmare got worse. But as he shifted into drive, a powerful hand reached through the open window and grabbed his shirt collar. Mike yanked Torres halfway through the window with one smooth motion, then delivered a precise knockout punch that put the third man to sleep instantly. Torres slumped half in and half out of the vehicle, his legs still tangled in the steering wheel. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Mike straightened his t-shirt and looked around. 3 men down in under 30 seconds. Not bad for a 58-year-old retiree. The girl was staring at him with her mouth open, pressing herself against the Honda where Kowalski lay motionless. Her face was a mixture of terror, relief, and something else, recognition. Mike walked over and began gathering her scattered textbooks from the sidewalk. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, his voice completely different from the cold authority he'd used on her attackers. She shook her head slowly, still staring. You're Mike Tyson." "Yes, I am." He handed her the books, checking to make sure she wasn't injured. "What's your name?" "Becky," she whispered. "Rebecca Martinez." The sirens were getting closer. Mike could see curious faces pressed against windows up and down the block. People who had been too scared to help, but were brave enough to watch the aftermath. "We need to talk, Rebecca," Mike said, helping her stand. Her legs were shaky, but she seemed physically unharmed. "But not here. Too many people, too many questions." She nodded, still clutching her textbooks like a lifeline. "I know a place. Delancey's Diner, 3 blocks from here." Mike glanced at the 3 unconscious men scattered around the street. Kowalski was starting to stir, groaning softly. In a few minutes, this place would be crawling with police, reporters, and curious onlookers. "Let's go," Mike said. As they walked away from the chaos, Becky kept glancing at him sideways. "Thank you," she finally said. I thought I was going to die." "Nobody's going to hurt you now," Mike replied. And he meant it. Behind them, the first police cars arrived at the scene, their red and blue lights painting the morning in chaotic colors. But Mike and Becky were already 3 blocks away, disappearing into the crowded Brooklyn streets. Whatever had just happened, Mike knew this was only the beginning. Delancey's Diner was exactly the kind of place Mike preferred: simple, honest. Food served by people who minded their own business. He and Becky sat in a back booth, away from the windows, 2 cups of black coffee growing cold between them. Becky wrapped her hands around her cup, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Now that the immediate danger was over, the full weight of what had happened was hitting her. "Tell me what this is really about," Mike said quietly. "Those weren't random street criminals. They knew you. They were specifically hunting you." Becky nodded, her dark eyes still wide with fear. "It started 3 weeks ago. I was walking home from my job at the pediatric clinic. I work part-time while I'm in college. Criminal justice major at Brooklyn College." She took a shaky sip of coffee before continuing. "I live in this old apartment building in Bensonhurst. The alley behind the building is usually empty, but that night there were cars there. Expensive cars. And men in suits." Mike leaned forward slightly. "What kind of meeting?" "At first, I thought it was drugs," Becky said. "You know, dealers and buyers. But it was different. More organized. The men in suits had briefcases. The other guys looked like muscle. Real muscle, not just street punks." She pulled out her phone with unsteady hands, scrolling through her photos. "I took some pictures. I thought maybe I could report it to the police, help clean up the neighborhood." Mike studied the blurry images on her phone screen. Even in the poor lighting, he could make out faces, license plates, and briefcase exchanges. But what caught his attention was one particular man in an expensive overcoat, tall, lean, with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged in a boardroom or a courtroom. This wasn't street-level crime. This was something much bigger. "What happened after you took the pictures?" Mike asked. "The next day, I started getting phone calls. No voice, just breathing. Then my apartment was broken into while I was at school. Nothing was stolen, but everything was turned upside down. Like they were looking for something. Becky's voice got smaller. Then the following happened. Men would follow me to class, to work, back home. Always the same black SUVs. Always watching. Mike felt a familiar anger building in his chest. The same protective fury that had driven him to championship after championship. Someone was terrorizing this brave young woman, and they thought they could get away with it. Why didn't you go to the police? He asked. Becky laughed bitterly. I tried. I filed a report about the break-in. The officer barely wrote anything down, said it was probably just a random burglary. When I mentioned the cars following me, he suggested I was being paranoid because of stress from college. Mike wasn't surprised. He'd seen enough corruption in his lifetime to know that money could buy silence from people who should be protecting the innocent. This morning was the first time they tried to actually grab me, Becky continued. I was walking to class when that guy just appeared out of nowhere. Started dragging me toward the car. She looked directly at Mike for the first time since they'd sat down. If you hadn't been there. But I was there, Mike said firmly. And now we're going to figure out who these people are and what they want. He studied the photos again, memorizing faces and details. The man in the expensive overcoat bothered him the most. That kind of sophisticated appearance usually meant connections, political connections, legal connections, the kind that made criminals untouchable. These aren't drug dealers, Mike said grimly. This looks like human trafficking. Becky's face went pale. What? Young women disappearing. Organized transportation. Men in suits with briefcases full of money. It all fits the pattern. Mike's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and saw a familiar name. Detective Frank Castellano. Heard you were involved in an incident. We need to talk. Meet me at Prospect Park, usual spot. 1 hour. Mike looked at Becky, who was staring at her coffee cup with the expression of someone whose world had just gotten much more dangerous. I have to meet someone, Mike said. A friend in the police department. Someone I trust. What about me? Becky asked. What if they come back? Mike reached across the table and gently touched her hand. You're going to be fine. But we need help from someone who understands how these operations work. He stood up, leaving money on the table for the coffee. Stay here for an hour. Order some food. Keep your head down. I'll be back with answers. As Mike walked toward the diner's exit, Becky called after him softly. Mr. Tyson? Thank you. For everything. Mike nodded and stepped back into the Brooklyn morning. But now the familiar streets felt different, more dangerous, full of shadows and hidden threats. Somewhere out there, powerful people were hunting an innocent college student. They'd made their first mistake by underestimating her courage. Their second mistake was thinking they could intimidate Mike Tyson. Prospect Park soldiers and Sailors Monument stood like a silent guardian over the tree-lined paths where Mike had jogged countless mornings during his comeback years. At 10:30 a.m., Detective Frank Castellano sat on their usual bench, tossing breadcrumbs to a small crowd of pigeons. Frank looked older than his 52 years. 20 years of walking Brooklyn streets had carved deep lines around his tired blue eyes, and his rumpled gray suit had seen better decades. But Mike knew those eyes still missed nothing, and the badge pinned to Frank's jacket still meant something to the man who wore it. Heard you had some excitement this morning, Frank said without looking up as Mike approached. 3 guys in the hospital, one with a broken jaw that'll need surgery. Mike sat down beside him. They were dragging a college girl toward a van. What would you have done? Same thing you did, probably. Frank scattered the remaining breadcrumbs and turned to face Mike. But this wasn't random, was it? You don't get that kind of coordinated response unless someone's already watching. The girl's name is Rebecca Martinez. She's been stalked for 3 weeks after witnessing some kind of meeting. Men in suits, briefcases, expensive cars. Frank's expression darkened. Martinez. That name rings a bell. He pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in careful handwriting. Yeah, here it is. Detective Rafael Martinez, killed 3 years ago in what looked like a random bodega shooting. Good cop, worked missing persons. Mike felt something cold settle in his stomach. This girl's his daughter? If it's the same Martinez, yeah. Frank closed the notebook and looked directly at Mike. And if she's been asking questions about cases her father worked, that would explain why someone wants her gone. Frank stood and started walking deeper into the park, away from the main paths where conversations could be overheard. Mike followed, noting how the detective's hand stayed close to his service weapon. I've been tracking a pattern for 8 months, Frank said quietly. 7 young women disappeared from our precinct. Ages 16 to 22, all from working class families. Cases get opened, then mysteriously reassigned or closed due to lack of evidence. They stopped beside a small pond where ducks floated peacefully, oblivious to the darkness being discussed above them. Witnesses disappear or suddenly change their stories, Frank continued. Security footage goes missing. Physical evidence gets lost in processing. Someone with serious juice is making these cases go away. Mike studied his old friend's face. You think it's trafficking? I know it is. But knowing and proving are two different things. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. I've been keeping my own files. Off the books. Everything the department lost, I kept copies. The folder was heavy in Mike's hands. Inside were photographs, witness statements, financial records, and surveillance photos taken from Frank's personal camera. This is Victor Petrov, Frank said, pointing to a surveillance shot of a tall man in an expensive overcoat. Russian organized crime, moved to Brooklyn 5 years ago. Officially, he runs legitimate businesses, restaurants, car services, import-export. Unofficially, he's been expanding into human trafficking. Mike studied the photo. It was the same man from Becky's blurry cell phone pictures. He's got protection, Frank warned. Political connections, judges on payroll, cops who look the other way. That's why cases disappear. That's why families get told their daughters probably ran away. What about federal involvement? Mike asked Frank. Laughed bitterly. I tried. FBI says local trafficking isn't their priority unless it crosses state lines. ICE says these aren't immigration cases. Everyone passes the buck while girls disappear. They began walking back toward the monument, Frank's frustration evident in every step. I can't investigate this officially anymore, Frank said. My captain made it clear that pursuing unfounded trafficking theories would be bad for my health and my pension. He stopped and turned to Mike. But if someone were to shake some trees and see what falls out? Someone who doesn't answer to the department or city hall. Mike took the folder and tucked it under his arm. Consider them shaken. They shook hands, both understanding the dangerous path ahead. Frank was risking his career. Mike was risking much more. Watch your back, champ, Frank said. These people don't play games. Mike's apartment building looked normal from the outside. Same brick facade, same fire escapes zigzagging up the walls, same elderly neighbors sitting on the front steps enjoying the evening air. But as Mike climbed to the 3rd floor at 6:30 p.m., he noticed his door was slightly ajar. The hallway smelled wrong. Too much aftershave mixed with something else. Fear, maybe, or violence recently committed. Mike pushed the door open carefully, his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance. His apartment had been destroyed. Every window was shattered. Glass scattered across the hardwood floor like deadly confetti. Furniture was overturned and slashed, stuffing pulled from cushions and scattered everywhere. His small kitchen table was smashed to pieces, chairs broken and piled in the corner. But the worst damage was personal. His championship belts, the tangible proof of everything he'd achieved in the ring, had been urinated on and thrown in a corner. Photographs of his family were torn and scattered. Books were ripped apart, pages covering the floor like snow. On the wall, spray painted in red letters, were the messages. Mind your business, has been, and next time you die. Mike stepped carefully through the destruction, his anger building like pressure in a boiler. This wasn't just vandalism. This was psychological warfare, designed to break his spirit and send a message to IT. Had exactly the opposite effect. Mr. Tyson, a voice called from the hallway. Mr. Tyson, is that you? Carlos Valdez, the building superintendent, appeared in the doorway. The 45-year-old man looked terrified, his hands shaking as he surveyed the damage. I found it like this around 3 o'clock, Carlos said. Door was kicked right off the hinges. I wanted to call the police, but he gestured helplessly. These men, they told me to keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me. What men? Mike asked quietly. Big guys. Expensive clothes, but mean faces. They said this was just a warning. Said next time would be worse. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Mrs. Washington appeared, followed by Giuseppe Moretti. Both elderly neighbors looked frightened but determined. Mike, honey, are you all right? Mrs. Washington asked, her voice full of motherly concern despite her own obvious fear. We saw them leaving. Giuseppe added, his thick accent more pronounced. When he was upset. 4 men in a black car. Same car that's been parking outside my store all week. Mike picked up one of his championship belts, carefully cleaning it with a torn piece of cloth. The leather was damaged, but the gold was still there. Still real. Still his. They think this will scare me, he said, more to himself than to his neighbors. Mike, Mrs. Washington said gently, maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight. These men, they don't seem like the type to give up. Mike looked at the destruction around him, then at the concerned faces of his neighbors. Good people who had lived in fear too long. People who deserved better than to be terrorized by criminals who thought money and violence made them untouchable. I'm not going anywhere, he said firmly. This is my home. This is our neighborhood. His phone rang, interrupting the moment. The caller ID showed Becky's number. Mike, her voice was tight with fear. They took my coworker Maria. She was walking to her car after her shift at the hospital. 3 men in a black SUV just took her. Mike closed his eyes, feeling the last of his patience disappear. First the apartment. Now another innocent girl. Where are you? He asked. Still at the hospital. The police are here, but they're asking the same useless questions. Saying maybe she went somewhere willingly. Maybe she had boyfriend trouble. I'm on my way, Mike said that he hung up and looked at his destroyed apartment one more time. Then he carefully folded his championship belt and placed it in his jacket pocket. Mrs. Washington, Giuseppe, he said, you might want to stay with relatives. Tonight, things are about to get dangerous. As Mike walked down the hallway, Carlos called after him. Mr. Tyson, what should I do about the door? Mike paused at the top of the stairs. Leave it open. I want them to see I'm not hiding. His voice was quiet, but it carried a promise that made all 3 neighbors step back instinctively. The old Mike Tyson, the one who had terrified the boxing world, was waking up. Brooklyn Methodist Hospital's parking lot was poorly lit, with too many shadows where predators could hide. Mike found Becky standing near the emergency room entrance at 7:45 p.m., her medical scrubs wrinkled and her face pale with exhaustion and fear. They won't listen, she said immediately as Mike approached. The police took a statement, but I can tell they think Maria just left with some guy she knew. Becky's hands shook as she showed Mike security footage on her phone. The hospital cameras caught this much before they drove away. Mike studied the blurry video. 3 men forcing a young woman into a black SUV. The license plate was partially visible, enough to match one of the numbers from Frank's files. Tell me about Maria, Mike said. Maria Santos, 20 years old, nursing student. Sweetest girl you ever met. Becky wiped away tears. She's from El Salvador, sending money home to her family. Works double shifts and never complains. She doesn't have a boyfriend, doesn't party, doesn't do anything that would make her voluntarily get in a car with strange men. Mike felt the familiar rage building again. Another innocent girl, another family that would spend tonight wondering if their daughter was alive. We need more information, he said. It's time to take this fight directly to them. For the next 3 hours, Mike and Becky systematically visited every business connected to Victor Petrov's operation. The check-cashing store on 4th Avenue, where nervous employees suddenly became very interested in paperwork when Mike walked in. The car service company on Bay Ridge, where dispatch orders stopped flowing and drivers found reasons to stay in their vehicles. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., they sat in Mike's car outside the Neptune restaurant. The upscale establishment looked legitimate. Valet parking, well-dressed customers, soft lighting visible through elegant windows. But Mike's experienced eyes noted the details that marked it as something else. Security cameras at every angle, bouncer types in expensive suits stationed at key positions, and a white Bentley with tinted windows parked in the reserved space closest to the building. That's got to be his car, Becky said, pointing to the Bentley. Mike nodded, memorizing the layout. 2 entrances, 1 emergency exit, kitchen access through a service alley. If he was going to confront Victor Petrov, this would be the place. The security is professional, Mike observed. Not just restaurant staff. These are people who know how to handle trouble. Becky studied the building with the analytical mind of a criminal justice student. How many do you think are inside? At least 6 that I can see. Probably more in back. Mike started the car's engine. Too many for a direct approach during business hours. As they prepared to leave, Becky grabbed Mike's arm. We need more than observation. We need evidence. Witnesses, something that will make the police actually investigate. Mike looked at her determined face, seeing echoes of her murdered father's courage. Tomorrow night, I go in directly, face to face with Victor. That's exactly what they want, Becky protested. You walking into their trap. Mike's expression was calm but implacable. Sometimes you have to walk into the trap to spring it properly. He drove Becky home, making sure she got safely inside her building. Then he returned to his vandalized apartment, stepping carefully over the broken glass and torn photographs. But instead of trying to clean up, Mike sat in his single remaining chair and began studying Frank's files by lamplight. Every photograph, every witness statement, every piece of evidence the police had lost. The pattern was clear now. Young women disappearing from specific neighborhoods, transportation through legitimate businesses, protection from corrupt officials, and at the center of it all, Viktor Petrov, untouchable, arrogant, confident that money and fear would keep him safe. Mike closed the files and looked at his destroyed championship belt lying on the kitchen counter. They'd tried to humiliate him, to make him feel powerless and old. Instead, they'd reminded him who he used to be. And tomorrow night, Viktor Petrov was going to learn the difference between a has-been and a legend who was just getting started. The Neptune restaurant fell silent when Mike Tyson walked through the front door at 7:00 p.m. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Waiters froze with plates in their hands. Even the soft jazz music seemed to quiet as every eye in the elegant dining room turned toward the man in the dark suit who moved with the controlled grace of a predator. Mike had dressed carefully for this confrontation. His black suit was simple but well-tailored, emphasizing his still powerful frame. His shoes were polished, his shirt crisp white, his tie dark blue. He looked like a man going to church or a funeral, and in a way, he was attending both. The maitre d' approached nervously, his practiced smile wavering. Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation? I'm here to see Victor, Mike said quietly. His voice carried clearly through the hushed room. Before the maitre d' could respond, a door at the back of the restaurant opened. Viktor Petrov emerged. Like a spider sensing vibrations in his web, he was exactly what Mike had expected from the surveillance photos, tall and lean, with the kind of dangerous elegance that came from years of sophisticated violence. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit expensive enough to feed a family for months. But it was his eyes that told the real story, cold, calculating, completely without empathy. The great Mike Tyson, Victor said, approaching with his arms spread in false welcome. What an honor. You grace my humble establishment. Cut the act, Mike replied. We both know why I'm here. Victor's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his posture. Around the dining room, Mike noticed three men casually repositioning themselves. Not customers, security. Professional muscle trying to look like civilians. Please, join me, Victor said, gesturing toward a private booth in the corner. We have much to discuss. As they sat down, Mike studied Victor's face up close. This was a man who had ordered terrible things done to innocent people without losing a single night of sleep. The kind of monster who wore expensive cologne to mask the smell of other people's blood. You've caused me some inconvenience, Victor said, pouring himself a glass of wine from an expensive bottle. My employees are in the hospital. My business operations have been disrupted. Your employees were kidnapping a college student. Mike said, your business operations involve human trafficking. Victor laughed, a sound like ice cracking. Such serious accusations. Where's your evidence? Your witnesses? Your proof? I have everything I need. Do you? Victor's mask began to slip, revealing the predator beneath the civilized facade. Because from where I sit, you're just a washed-up fighter who doesn't know when to stay retired. Mike felt his hands tighten involuntarily. 30 years of controlling his temper, and this piece of garbage was testing every limit. Brooklyn is changing, champion, Victor continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Old heroes should learn to enjoy their retirement quietly. Bad things happen to people who don't understand the new rules. The only rule I understand, Mike said, is that monsters like you eventually get put down. Victor's smile disappeared entirely. Is that a threat? It's a promise. The three security men began moving closer to their table. Alexei Volkov, a heavily muscled man with prison tattoos visible on his neck. Dmitry Kozlov, younger but meaner, with the dead eyes of a killer. And Sergei Petrov, Victor's brother, family resemblance clear in their shared cruelty. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Victor said. I have judges in my pocket, politicians on my payroll, cops who do exactly what I tell them to do. And I have something you don't understand, Mike replied calmly, which is nothing left to lose. Victor's expression turned ugly. You think your reputation protects you? You think people still fear the great Mike Tyson? He leaned forward, his voice full of venom. You're just another broken-down ex-con who can't accept that his time is over. That was the moment Mike's legendary temper finally snapped. But it was Sergei who moved first, swinging a wine bottle at Mike's head in a vicious arc. Mike ducked smoothly, the bottle shattering against the booth's wooden frame, and delivered his signature uppercut. In return, Sergei's feet left the ground completely, his body lifting 3 feet into the air before crashing into the bar with a sound like a tree falling. Bottles exploded around him as he slumped unconscious to the floor. Alexei charged with a knife drawn, but Mike was already moving. A devastating left hook broke Alexei's wrist and sent the weapon spinning away. A follow-up right cross put the Russian down permanently. Dmitry tried to pull a gun from his jacket, but Mike covered the distance between them in 2 quick steps. The gun went flying as Mike's combination, left hook to the body, right uppercut to the jaw, dropped Dmitry like a stone. The entire fight lasted less than 20 seconds. Mike straightened his tie and looked around the destroyed restaurant. Victor was already backing toward the kitchen door, his face white with shock. This isn't over, Victor snarled. You have no idea what you've started. Ask the girl about her father, Victor called out as he fled. Detective Martinez. Ask her how he really died 3 years ago investigating people like me. Then he was gone, leaving Mike standing among the wreckage and unconscious bodies, with a room full of terrified witnesses who would swear they'd never seen anything like it. Mike calmly walked out the front door, knowing that everything had just changed. The war had officially begun. Mike's hands were still bleeding from the restaurant fight when he called Becky at 11:30 p.m. The knuckles were split in 3 places, but the pain felt good, honest pain from honest work. I need to see you, he said into the phone. Tonight. It's about your father. 30 minutes later, Mike stood in the cramped living room of Becky's Bensonhurst apartment. The space was neat but clearly belonged to someone living paycheck to paycheck. Secondhand furniture, textbooks stacked everywhere, medical supplies from her clinic job organized on a small desk. Becky looked exhausted, still wearing her hospital scrubs from the long shift. But her eyes were alert, intelligent, waiting for answers she probably didn't want to hear. Victor said something tonight. Mike began gently. About your father. About how he really died. Becky's face went pale. What? Do you mean how he really died? He was killed in a bodega robbery 3 years ago. Random violence. Mike sat down across from her, choosing his words carefully. Frank Castellano ran the name Martinez. Your father was Detective Rafael Martinez, wasn't he? Yes, but he was investigating missing women cases. The same pattern we're seeing now. Mike pulled out Frank's files, spreading photographs and documents across her coffee table. Your father was getting close to exposing Victor's trafficking operation. Becky stared at the papers, her hands trembling. Among the documents was a police report she'd never seen before. Her father's real investigation notes, documenting connections between missing women and corrupt city officials. This says he was supposed to testify to internal affairs, she whispered, reading through tear-filled eyes. 3 days after he was killed. The bodega shooting was staged, Mike said quietly. Your father was murdered somewhere else, then. His body was moved. Victor had him killed to protect the trafficking ring. Becky collapsed into her chair, the weight of 3 years of lies crashing down on her. They told me he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That he tried to stop a robbery and got shot for being a hero. He was a hero, Mike said firmly. But not the way they told you. He was killed because he wouldn't stop fighting for those missing girls. She looked up at Mike through her tears. All this time, I thought I was studying criminal justice to honor his memory. But I was living a lie. You were living the lie they wanted you to believe, Mike corrected. But now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Becky wiped her eyes and stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the alley where she'd first seen Victor's meeting. Her grief was transforming before Mike's eyes. crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. They killed my father for trying to protect girls like Maria Santos, she said, her voice growing stronger. Girls like me. That's right. And they think they can just keep doing it. Keep taking innocent women, keep corrupting officials, keep murdering cops who try to stop them. Mike nodded, watching her process the revelation. This was the moment that would define who Rebecca Martinez really was, victim or fighter. I want to finish what my father started, she said, turning to face Mike with a determination that would have made Detective Martinez proud. I want to destroy Viktor Petrov and everyone who protected him. It won't be easy, Mike warned. These people have money, connections, and no conscience. They'll try to kill us both before this is over. Becky picked up one of her father's case files, holding it like a sacred text. Then we better make sure they don't succeed. At 2 a.m., as Mike prepared to leave, Becky made a solemn vow. They killed him because he wouldn't stop fighting. I won't stop either. Mike smiled grimly as he headed for the door. Viktor Petrov had just made his biggest mistake. He'd given Rebecca Martinez a reason to become as dangerous as her father. The next phase of the war was about to begin. Mike entered St. Anthony's Catholic Church at 8 a.m., seeking the kind of peace that only came from sacred spaces. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored light across empty wooden pews that had witnessed decades of prayers, confessions, and quiet desperation. Father Anthony Russo was kneeling before the altar, his white hair gleaming in the multicolored light. At 67, the priest still carried himself with the solid frame of his former boxing days, his movements deliberate and confident. I wondered when you'd come, Father Russo said without turning around. Word travels fast in this neighborhood, especially when someone takes on Viktor Petrov's crew and walks away. Mike slid into a front pew, his hands still sore from the restaurant. Fight. I need guidance, Father. This thing is bigger than I thought. Father Russo finished his prayer and turned to face Mike, his brown eyes kind but sharp with intelligence. You're not here for spiritual counsel, Mike. You're here because you recognize a fellow soldier. The priest was right. Something about Father Russo reminded Mike of the best officers he'd known during his brief military service. Men who understood that sometimes faith required action, not just prayer. How much do you know about what's happening in this neighborhood? Mike asked. Father Russo walked to a side door and gestured for Mike to follow. More than the police. More than City Hall wants to admit. Come with me. They descended into the church basement, past Sunday school classrooms and storage areas, to a small office that looked more like a detective's headquarters than a priest's study. The walls were covered with photographs, maps, and detailed charts showing connections between missing persons cases. 7 young women in the past year, Father Russo said, pointing to a wall of photographs. All between 16 and 22. All from working-class families who can't afford private investigators or political influence. Mike studied the faces. Maria Santos was there, along with 6 others whose disappearances had been dismissed or ignored by official channels. I've been documenting everything for 8 months, Father Russo continued. Families come to me when the police won't listen. I take their statements, photograph evidence, track patterns that investigators claim don't exist. The priest opened a locked filing cabinet, revealing carefully organized folders thick with documentation. Financial records showing suspicious cash transactions. Testimony from families describing the same pattern of intimidation and threats. Even surveillance photos I took myself. Why didn't you take this to the FBI? Mike asked. Father Russo laughed bitterly. I tried. They said local prostitution wasn't federal jurisdiction unless it crossed state lines. But these aren't prostitutes, Mike. These are honor students and nursing students and young mothers who worked honest jobs. He pulled out a folder marked Official Corruption and showed Mike bank records and political contribution reports. 3 city council members, 2 judges, and at least 4 high-ranking police officials have received substantial payments from companies linked to Viktor's operation. Mike felt the familiar anger building. How deep does this go? Deep enough that families are afraid to report their daughters missing, Father Russo replied. Deep enough that witnesses change their stories after midnight visits from well-dressed men. Deep enough that evidence disappears from police storage facilities. The priest sat down behind his desk, his hands folded in a gesture that was part prayer, part preparation for battle. I became a priest after Vietnam, he said quietly. Thought I was done fighting. But sometimes evil is so obvious, so destructive. That faith demands action. Mike understood completely. What kind of action? Father Russo smiled. Not the gentle smile of a shepherd, but the hard smile of a golden gloves boxer who'd never forgotten how to throw a punch. 3 parishes in this area have been tracking similar patterns. We've got documentation, witness testimony, and a community that's ready to fight back. They just need someone to show them how. He led Mike to another room in the basement, a fully equipped gymnasium with heavy bags, speed bags, and wrestling mats. The equipment was well maintained and obviously used regularly. I teach self-defense classes twice a week, Father Russo explained. Basic protection for women and teenagers. But what we really need is someone who can prepare them for war. Mike removed his jacket and examined the gym equipment. The heavy bag was positioned perfectly, the mats were professional quality, and the space could accommodate 20 or 30 people comfortably. The community is ready to stand up, Father Russo said. They just need a leader they can follow into battle. Mike tested the heavy bag with a light jab, feeling the familiar satisfaction of impact and resistance. When do we start? Tonight, Father Russo replied. Word is already spreading. People are tired of being afraid. As they climbed back upstairs, Father Russo placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. This isn't just about stopping Viktor Petrov. This is about showing people that they don't have to accept injustice, that they can fight back and win. Mike nodded, understanding that he'd found more than a sanctuary in St. Anthony's Church. He'd found a base of operations, an ally who understood both faith and warfare, and a community ready to transform from victims into fighters. The resistance was officially beginning by 6 p.m. that evening. Word had spread through the neighborhood. Like wildfire, Mike Tyson was teaching self-defense at St. Anthony's Church. The basement gymnasium filled with an unlikely army. Scared mothers clutching their purses, teenagers with nervous energy, elderly residents who remembered when the neighborhood was safe. 15 people showed up for the first session, but Mike could see dozens more in their faces. This was a community that had been pushed too far for too long, and they were ready to push back. Mrs. Eleanor Washington sat in a folding chair near the wall, her 82-year-old frame too frail for physical training, but her presence lending moral authority to the gathering. Giuseppe Moretti's grandson Anthony had driven over from Bay Ridge, bringing 3 friends who looked eager to learn from a legend. Tommy Rodriguez bounced on his toes near the heavy bag, barely containing his excitement. Mr. Tyson, are you really going to teach us to fight like you? I'm going to teach you to protect yourselves and each other, Mike corrected gently. Fighting is about more than throwing punches. It's about awareness, preparation, and knowing when to stand your ground. Mike had changed into simple gym clothes, sweatpants, t-shirt, boxing shoes that had seen thousands of training sessions. But his presence filled the room with quiet authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. Before we talk about physical techniques, Mike began, we need to understand what we're really fighting. This isn't about random crime or individual criminals. This is about organized predators who target our community because they think we're weak and divided. Becky entered quietly, still wearing her hospital scrubs from another long shift. She found a spot near the back, her eyes red from crying, but her jaw set with determination. The first rule of self-defense, Mike continued, is awareness. Know your surroundings, trust your instincts, and understand that evil often looks normal and respectable. He gestured toward the wall where Father Russo had hung the photographs of missing women. These girls weren't taken because they were careless or stupid. They were taken because predators study communities, looking for people they can isolate and intimidate. Anthony Moretti raised his hand. What if someone tries to grab my sister like they grabbed that girl yesterday? Mike demonstrated basic defensive positioning, how to maintain distance, how to break free from grabs, how to create opportunities to escape rather than engage in prolonged fighting. Your primary goal is always to get away safely, he emphasized. But if escape isn't possible, you need to be prepared to fight with everything you have. For the next hour, Mike taught fundamental techniques adapted for ordinary people, not trained fighters. Basic strikes to vulnerable targets. How to use everyday objects as defensive weapons. Most importantly, how to move and think as a group, rather than isolated individuals. Mrs. Washington watched everything with sharp eyes. In my day, she called out, neighborhoods looked after each other. Nobody would dare snatch a girl off the street because they knew 50 people were watching. That's exactly right, Mike said. Predators rely on isolation and fear. When communities stand together, criminals lose their advantage. Tommy proved to be a natural student, picking up techniques quickly and helping slower learners with patient encouragement. The older residents focused more on awareness and communication strategies, understanding that their role was observation and coordination rather than direct confrontation. As the session ended, people clustered around Mike with questions, concerns, and offers of support. Giuseppe brought news that his bodega could serve as a communication hub. Mrs. Washington volunteered to coordinate a telephone network among elderly residents who were home during the day. This is just the beginning, Mike told the group as they prepared to leave. Tomorrow night, we'll expand the training. But remember, we're not just learning to fight. We're learning to stand together. As people filed out, Tommy approached Mike with obvious excitement. My sister Isabella works downtown cleaning offices at night. She says she's seen those same black SUVs around the business district. Maybe we should check it out. Mike and Becky exchanged meaningful looks. The investigation was expanding beyond the neighborhood, and they were gathering intelligence from sources the police had never thought to consult. Father Russo locked the gym equipment as the last residents headed home. How did it feel? He asked Mike. Like something I should have been doing all along, Mike replied. Through the church's basement windows, they could see people walking home in small groups, talking quietly but moving with more confidence than they'd shown in months. The community was transforming from victims into fighters, one lesson at a time. Detective Frank Castellano stood in the marble lobby of Brooklyn City Hall at 10 a.m., trying to look like he belonged among the politicians and bureaucrats hurrying to important meetings. His rumpled suit and tired expression marked him as an outsider in this world of power and privilege. For 3 hours, Frank had been conducting discreet inquiries into Councilman Bradley Hutchins's recent financial activities. What he discovered made his stomach turn. Mike arrived precisely on time, looking incongruous among the city officials in his simple dark clothes. But his presence commanded attention. Several people recognized the legendary boxer and whispered excitedly as he passed. Walk with me, Frank said quietly, leading Mike toward a small coffee shop across the street. We can't talk inside. Too many ears. The coffee shop was nearly empty at mid-morning, with only a few retired residents reading newspapers and avoiding the rain that had started falling. Frank chose a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. I've been digging into Councilman Hutchins, Frank began, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. What I found is worse than we thought. The first document was a bank statement showing deposits of $50,000 every month. For the past 18 months, far more than a city councilman's salary could account for. Shell companies, Frank explained, pointing to the deposit sources, all traced back to businesses that Victor controls. Check cashing stores, car services, import companies. All legitimate on paper, all funneling money to Hutchins. Mike studied the financial records, noting the careful timing of payments and their correlation with city council votes on police funding and anti-trafficking measures. It gets worse, Frank continued, showing Mike voting records. Every time there's been a proposal to increase funding for missing persons investigations, Hutchins votes against it. Every time someone suggests creating a task force for human trafficking, he finds procedural reasons to delay or kill the proposal. The pattern was clear and damning. Hutchins wasn't just taking bribes. He was actively sabotaging efforts to investigate Victor's operation. Here's the smoking gun, Frank said, producing photographs taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. Yesterday morning, Hutchins met with Victor at a private club in Manhattan. Cash envelope changed hands. Lasted exactly 12 minutes. Mike felt his anger building again. But this was a different kind of rage than he'd felt fighting street thugs. This was the cold fury that came from seeing the system itself corrupted from within. How high does this go? Mike asked. Frank pulled out more documents, contribution records, meeting schedules, communication logs obtained through sources he couldn't officially acknowledge. 2 federal judges have received substantial contributions from companies in Victor's network, Frank said grimly. At least 4 detectives in our precinct are on the payroll. That's why cases get reassigned or evidence disappears. And internal affairs investigations into missing persons are routinely transferred away from competent investigators. Mike understood now why families like the Martinezes had been told their loved ones were victims of random crime rather than organized trafficking. There's something else, Frank said, lowering his voice even further. I got a call this morning. Anonymous tip that 2 more young women disappeared last night from different neighborhoods. Same pattern, grabbed off the street, black SUVs. Witnesses too scared to talk. They're accelerating, Mike observed. Getting desperate, Frank corrected. Your fight with Victor's crew at the restaurant has them rattled. Word is spreading that someone's finally fighting back, and they're trying to grab as many victims as possible before this gets worse. Frank closed the files and looked directly at Mike. I can't investigate this officially anymore. My captain made it clear that pursuing unfounded conspiracy theories about Councilman Hutchins would be bad for my health and my pension. What about federal authorities? I tried. FBI says they're monitoring the situation, but won't take action without more evidence. They want court-admissible proof, witness testimony, financial records that can survive legal challenges. Frank gestured at his folder. Everything I've got was obtained through unofficial channels. It's enough to know what's happening, but not enough to prosecute anyone. Mike stood up, his decision made. Then we get the evidence they need. How? By making them desperate enough to make mistakes, Mike said. Desperate people do stupid things. Stupid things create evidence. As they prepared to leave, Frank grabbed Mike's arm. These aren't street thugs anymore, Mike. This is organized crime with political protection. They'll come at you with everything they have. Mike's expression was calm but implacable. Good. Let them come. Outside, the rain was falling harder, washing the city clean but unable to cleanse the corruption that ran through its veins like poison. The war was escalating, and Mike Tyson was ready for the next battle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Brooklyn College's campus as Becky Martinez walked toward the subway station at 3 p.m. Her criminal justice textbooks felt heavier than usual, weighed down by everything she'd learned about her father's real death and Victor's trafficking operation. The black SUV appeared in her peripheral vision as she reached the corner of Avenue H. Same tinted windows, same predatory stillness she'd noticed for weeks. But this time, instead of just following, it was moving to intercept her path. Becky's training kicked in. The awareness techniques Mike had taught her, combined with her own street-smart instincts. She turned sharply into a busy shopping plaza, weaving between afternoon shoppers and delivery trucks. The SUV followed, its engine growling as it navigated the crowded parking areas. Becky ducked into a department store, moving quickly through the aisles while watching the entrance through security mirrors. 2 men in dark jackets entered 30 seconds later, scanning the store with professional efficiency. She recognized one immediately, Alexei Volkov, his broken wrist now in a cast, but his face still bearing bruises from Mike's devastating punches at the restaurant. His companion was younger, meaner looking, with the dead eyes of someone who enjoyed hurting people. Using the store's rear exit, Becky emerged into a service alley that connected to a multi-level parking garage. She ran toward her Honda Civic. On the 3rd floor, keys already in her hand. But Victor's men had anticipated her escape route. As Becky reached the stairwell, Boris Antonov stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. At 26, he was built like a linebacker, with scarred knuckles and a gold tooth that flashed when he smiled. Going somewhere, college girl? Boris asked in heavily accented English. Becky spun around to retreat, but Ivan Petrov blocked her path from behind. Victor's cousin was smaller than the others, but carried himself with the coiled tension of a snake ready to strike. We just want to talk, Alexei said, approaching with his good hand extended in a gesture of false peace. You and your friend caused us some trouble. Time to make things right. Becky backed against the stairwell wall, clutching her textbooks like a shield. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. If she could activate the panic app Mike had insisted she install, stay back, she warned, her voice stronger than she felt. People know where I am. They're expecting me. Boris laughed. Nobody's coming to help you, little girl. Just like nobody helped your daddy when we put a bullet in his head. The casual mention of her father's murder triggered something primal in Becky. Instead of cowering, she swung her heaviest textbook at Boris's face, catching him across the nose with enough force to draw blood. Bitch! Boris roared, Lunging forward, Becky slipped sideways, using the stairwell's narrow space to limit their ability to surround her. Her fingers found her phone, desperately trying to activate the panic button while dodging grasping hands. The app activated just as Ivan grabbed her arm. A silent alert shot out to Mike's phone, along with her exact GPS coordinates. But her victory was short-lived. Alexei produced a chloroform-soaked cloth from his jacket, pressing it against her face. As Boris and Ivan held her arms. "Sweet dreams, college girl," Alexei whispered. Becky fought until consciousness faded, her last clear thought being a desperate hope that Mike would receive her signal in time. When she woke up, she was in the back of the SUV, wrists zip-tied, head pounding from the chemical. Through the tinted windows, she could see warehouse districts and industrial buildings. On the seat beside her was a handwritten note. "Champion, Warehouse District, Pier 47, midnight. Come alone or the girl and the others die. No police or everyone burns." As the SUV pulled into a maze of shipping containers and abandoned buildings, Becky realized she'd become bait in a trap designed to destroy the only man who could stop victors. Operation. The final confrontation was about to begin. Mike approached Pier 47 at 11:45 p.m., moving through the warehouse district like a shadow in expensive darkness. The industrial maze of shipping containers and abandoned buildings stretched endlessly under dim security lights that created more shadows than illumination. Despite Frank and Father Russo's protests, he'd come alone. Victor had been clear: any sign of backup, and the hostages would die. Mike wouldn't risk Becky's life or the lives of other innocent women on a tactical gamble. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive structure of corrugated steel and broken windows. Mike counted at least 4 guards positioned around the perimeter, their cigarette tips glowing like fireflies in the darkness. But Mike hadn't survived 30 years in boxing by charging straight ahead. He circled the building first, noting emergency exits, security cameras, and the patterns of the roving patrols. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Through a partially boarded window, Mike glimpsed the full scope of Victor's operation. Shipping containers had been modified into holding cells, their steel walls lined with basic amenities: cots, buckets, chains. A dozen young women were imprisoned in this hellish facility, including Becky and Maria Santos. This wasn't just about silencing one witness. This was a fully operational trafficking hub, designed to process human beings like cargo. Mike's entry point was a service ladder leading to the warehouse's upper level. He climbed silently, his boxing footwork adapted for stealth movement across catwalks and between industrial equipment. The first guard never heard him coming. A precise chokehold rendered the man unconscious without a sound, his body hidden behind a stack of crates. But Victor had prepared well. As Mike descended to the main floor, lights flooded the warehouse and 8 armed men emerged from strategic positions. "Welcome, champion," Victor's voice echoed through hidden speakers. "I hope you're ready for your final performance." The fight that followed would be talked about in Brooklyn for decades. Mike moved through the warehouse like a force of nature, using every technique he'd perfected over 30 years of professional combat. His uppercuts sent men flying into steel walls with bone-crushing impact. His hooks dropped attackers before they could raise their weapons. His footwork kept him mobile, preventing any single opponent from gaining advantage. The first 3 men fell within 60 seconds, a combination of precise strikes that left them unconscious on the concrete floor. Mike used the industrial environment to his advantage, bouncing opponents off shipping containers and using narrow passages to limit their ability to surround him. On the warehouse's second level, 2 more guards tried to pin him down with automatic weapons. Mike used the steel catwalks for cover, closing distance through a series of rolling movements that brought him within striking range. Both men were unconscious before they could reload. The final 3 attackers waited near the holding containers, using the imprisoned women as human shields. But Mike had faced similar situations in the ring. Opponents who tried to use rules and referees as protection, but he systematically dismantled their defensive positions, using thrown tools and industrial debris to create distractions while he closed distance. Each strike was calculated for maximum impact and minimum risk to the hostages. When the last guard fell, Mike began freeing the imprisoned women, breaking chains and locks with tools scattered around the warehouse. Becky was conscious but groggy. from the chloroform, tears streaming down her face as she saw the other victims. "How many?" Mike asked, helping her stand. 12 total, she whispered. "Some have been here for weeks." That's when Victor appeared for their final confrontation, emerging from a concealed office with a detonator in his hand. "Impressive, champion," Victor said calmly. "But this warehouse is rigged with explosives. Insurance against exactly this scenario." Before Mike could respond, Victor pressed the detonator. The warehouse erupted in flames and collapsing steel as carefully placed charges brought down sections of the structure. In the chaos of smoke and debris, Victor appeared to be caught beneath falling beams. Mike barely had time to evacuate all 12 women before the entire building became an inferno. As sirens approached in the distance, he led them to safety, believing he'd finally destroyed Victor's operation. But in the chaos, he never saw Victor's true escape route through a hidden tunnel system that led to the waterfront. Dawn broke over St. Anthony's Church at 6 a.m., painting the Brooklyn sky in shades of gold and pink. The basement gymnasium had been transformed into a makeshift medical center, where the 12 rescued women received treatment from volunteer nurses and counselors. Organized by Father Russo, the community celebration was spontaneous and joyful. Word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Mike Tyson had single-handedly destroyed a human trafficking ring and rescued a dozen victims. Giuseppe Moretti arrived with enough free food to feed an army, declaring it a neighborhood holiday. Becky sat on a folding chair, wrapped in a blanket, holding Maria Santos's hand as they both received medical attention. The reunion between the two young women brought tears to everyone who witnessed it. "I can't believe you found us," Maria whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of captivity. "I thought we were going to die in that place." Mrs. Washington moved through the crowd like a general surveying victory, organizing food distribution and coordinating with social workers who would help the victims rebuild their lives. Tommy Rodriguez and Anthony Moretti had appointed themselves as security guards, making sure no unwanted visitors disrupted the reunion. The media attention was overwhelming. News crews gathered outside the church, broadcasting live reports about the boxing legend's war on human trafficking. Mike found himself portrayed as a neighborhood hero who had accomplished what police and federal authorities couldn't or wouldn't do. Detective Frank arrived at noon with federal agents who would take over the investigation of Victor's business network. "This is bigger than anyone imagined," Frank told Mike privately. "The warehouse was just one piece. We're finding connections to operations in 3 other states." "What about Victor?" Mike asked. "Body hasn't been found yet, but nobody could have survived that collapse," Frank replied. "Looks like he got caught in his own fire." Father Russo conducted an impromptu prayer service at 2 p.m., thanking God for the safe return of the missing women and asking for healing for their traumatic experiences. The church was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering on the sidewalk. Becky approached Mike as the afternoon celebration continued. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved all of us. You got justice for my father. We saved each other," Mike corrected gently. "Your courage, your father's files, this community's support, none of this could have happened with just one person." As evening fell, the celebration gradually wound down. Families returned to their homes with a sense of safety they hadn't felt in months. The freed women were placed in protective custody and counseling programs. Media crews packed up their equipment, already moving on to the next story. At 8 p.m., Mike sat alone in the church gymnasium, surrounded by the remnants of the day's celebration. Despite the victory, something felt wrong. Too easy. Too complete. Father Russo found him there, staring at the wall where photographs of missing women had hung, now taken down because the victims had been found. "You don't seem satisfied with victory," the priest observed. Mike shook his head slowly. "Victor was too smart to get caught in his own fire. Something doesn't add up. Maybe you're just not used to winning this completely," Father Russo suggested. "Sometimes the good guys actually win." But Mike's instincts, honed by years of reading opponents and sensing danger, told him the fight wasn't over. Viktor Petrov was too careful, too intelligent, to die in such a convenient accident. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The image showed Detective Frank's badge and service weapon, photographed against a dark background. Below it, a simple message: The game isn't over, champion. Mike's blood ran cold. If Victor was alive, Frank was in immediate danger. The victory celebration had been premature. The real war was just beginning. Mike's tires screamed against wet pavement as he raced through Brooklyn streets toward Frank's apartment at 10:30 p.m. The threatening text message had transformed his earlier unease into cold terror. If Victor was alive, everyone who had helped expose the trafficking ring was now a target. Frank's building on Ocean Avenue looked normal from the outside. Same brick facade, same elderly residents sitting on the front steps despite the late hour. But as Mike climbed to the third floor, the hallway smelled wrong. Too much aftershave mixed with something metallic and final. The apartment door was ajar, hanging open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Mike found Detective Frank Castellanos. Body in the living room, execution-style bullet wound to the back of the head. Frank had been forced to kneel before being murdered, his hands zip-tied behind his back in a position of helpless submission, but the scene had been carefully staged. Mike's championship ring, stolen during the apartment vandalism, lay next to Frank's body in a pool of blood. Security cameras would show Mike entering the building. Ballistics would match a gun that could be traced back to him through fabricated evidence. Touching reunion, a familiar voice said from the shadows. Viktor Petrov emerged from the bedroom, very much alive, flanked by Councilman Bradley Hutchins and a corrupt police lieutenant Mike had never seen before. Lieutenant Warren Bradley was thick-set and mean-faced, with the look of a man who'd been taking bribes so long he'd forgotten what honest police work felt like. "Surprised to see me, champion?" Victor asked, his silver hair perfectly styled despite supposedly dying in a warehouse. "Fire hours earlier. Did you really think a simple building collapse could stop someone who survived 20 years in organized crime?" Mike's hands clenched involuntarily, but 3 guns were pointed at him from different angles. Even Mike Tyson couldn't fight. Bullets. The warehouse was always expendable. Victor continued conversationally. "Just like those girls, just like your friend Detective Castellano here. But you, champion, you're the real prize." Councilman Hutchins stepped forward, his political mask completely dropped to reveal the corrupt coward beneath. "Tomorrow morning, you'll be wanted for murdering a police officer, burning down legitimate businesses, and operating as an unhinged vigilante who's lost touch with reality. The media will have a field day," Lieutenant Bradley added with obvious satisfaction. Washed-up boxer finally snaps, kills the only honest cop trying to stop him. Classic story. Victor smiled with predatory satisfaction. "All those women you rescued have been reacquired during protective custody transfers. Federal authorities will discover they were never actually kidnapped, just confused victims of a delusional ex-champion's vigilante fantasies." Mike felt the carefully constructed case against the trafficking ring crumbling like sand. The evidence? What evidence? Victor laughed. Files that were illegally obtained? Witness testimony from traumatized women who'll now say they were coerced into making false statements? Security footage that shows you committing multiple felonies. The frame-up was comprehensive and professionally executed. Victor had used Mike's heroic nature against him, allowing him to feel like the victor while systematically eliminating every piece of legitimate evidence and every credible witness. "Your neighborhood friends will abandon you once they realize you've brought hell down on their heads," Victor continued. "That sweet girl Rebecca will discover that her father was actually corrupt, working with me before he got greedy and needed to be eliminated." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Victor and his team moved toward a pre-planned escape route through the apartment's fire escape. "You have perhaps 3 minutes before this building is surrounded by officers who believe you're an armed and dangerous cop killer." As they prepared to leave, Victor delivered his final insult. The game was never about who could fight better, champion. It was about who understood power. Money, connections, corruption, those are the only victories that matter. Mike grabbed Frank's hidden files from their concealed location behind the refrigerator, knowing they represented the only remaining proof of the trafficking operation's existence. The sirens were directly outside now, accompanied by the harsh glare of floodlights and the mechanical voice of police bullhorns demanding surrender. Mike escaped through Frank's bedroom window onto the fire escape, disappearing into the Brooklyn night as SWAT teams stormed the building. Behind him, News vans were already arriving to cover the story of Mike Tyson's fall from neighborhood hero to wanted fugitive by morning. He would be branded as a delusional vigilante whose reign of terror had finally ended in the murder of an innocent police officer. Viktor Petrov had won the second round through superior strategy and unlimited corruption. But the fight wasn't over yet. Mike slipped through the rear entrance of St. Anthony's Church at 2 a.m., using the key Father Russo had given him weeks earlier. The basement sanctuary felt like a tomb. As he descended into darkness, carrying Frank's hidden files and the weight of being Brooklyn's most wanted fugitive, the news coverage was already brutal. Channel 7's midnight broadcast led with "Boxing Legend Wanted for Cop Killing," accompanied by footage of Mike's greatest victories edited to make him look unhinged and violent. The narrative was simple and devastating: a washed-up champion who'd finally snapped under the pressure of irrelevance and mental decline. That Mike's phone service had been cut off. His bank accounts were frozen, credit cards canceled. Victor's reach extended into every system that modern life depended on, transforming Mike from respected neighbor to dangerous pariah with surgical precision. Father Russo found him in the gym at dawn, sitting on a bench with Frank's files spread around him like evidence from a trial that would never happen. "The whole neighborhood's talking," Father Russo said quietly, settling beside Mike with 2 cups of coffee. "Half believe the news reports. The other half know better." "What about the women we rescued?" Mike asked. "Gone. Transferred during the night for additional counseling and protection." Maria Santos's family was told she needed extended psychiatric treatment for trauma-induced delusions. Mike felt the systematic destruction of everything they'd accomplished. Victor hadn't just survived. He'd turned victory into defeat through superior planning and unlimited corruption. "Mrs. Washington came by an hour ago," Father Russo continued. "She saw Victor's men removing unconscious women from that protective custody van. Said they weren't being gentle about it." The priest showed Mike a handwritten list of names and phone numbers. Giuseppe witnessed Lieutenant Bradley accepting an envelope from Victor the day before Frank was murdered. Tommy Rodriguez got photographs of the exchange with his phone. Mike studied the list. Dozens of neighbors who'd observed pieces of Victor's operation but hadn't understood the significance until now. "They're starting to realize what really happened," Father Russo said. "That you're not the villain in this story." Through the basement windows, Mike could see police cars patrolling the streets above, their red and blue lights painting the morning in colors of pursuit and danger. "I can't stay here," Mike said. "If they find me, it'll destroy you and the church." Father Russo's response was firm. "This church has provided sanctuary to people fighting injustice for 70 years. I'm not about to stop now." The priest stood and walked to a locked cabinet, pulling out additional files Mike had never seen before. "While you were playing hero in that warehouse, I was documenting everything. Every bribe, every payoff, every connection between Victor and the corrupt officials protecting him." The files were extensive: photographs, financial records, witness statements, and recorded conversations Father Russo had been collecting for months. "Victor made one mistake," Father Russo said. "He assumed the community would abandon you once. The pressure got heavy. He doesn't understand that some neighborhoods still remember how to protect their own." Mike looked at the evidence surrounding him, then at the priest who'd risked everything to preserve it. Despite being hunted by every law enforcement agency in New York, he wasn't alone. "The community is asking what they can do to help," Father Russo said. "They know you didn't kill Frank." Mike stood up, decision crystallizing. "Then we fight back the only way we can, with the truth." As morning light streamed through the basement windows, Mike understood that this battle would be won not with his fists, but with the courage of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice. The real war was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Anthony's main hall at 8 a.m. as Father Russo prepared for the most important meeting of his 15-year ministry. Despite the risk of harboring a wanted fugitive, he'd called a community gathering under the guise of regular parish business. At by 8:30, over 50 residents had arrived, filling the wooden pews that had witnessed decades of prayers, confessions, and desperate hope. Mrs. Eleanor Washington sat in the front row, her 82-year-old frame radiating the kind of moral authority that came from surviving 8 decades of struggles. Giuseppe Moretti had closed his bodega to attend, bringing his grandson Anthony and 3 of the young men from Mike's self-defense classes. Tommy Rodriguez sat with his mother and sister, all 3 looking determined despite the obvious danger of being associated with Brooklyn's most wanted man. "We're here to talk about our neighborhood," Father Russo began, his voice carrying the quiet strength that made him a natural leader. "About what's been happening to our young women, our families, and our sense of safety." The room stirred with nervous energy. Everyone had seen the news coverage branding Mike Tyson as a dangerous vigilante, but they'd also lived through weeks of fear before Mike's intervention. Yesterday, the media told you that Mike Tyson murdered Detective Frank Castellano in a fit of madness. Father Russo continued. "I'm here to tell you that's a lie." Mrs. Washington stood up slowly, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "I was sitting on my stoop yesterday evening when I saw men in expensive suits removing unconscious women from what looked like a police van. Those girls weren't being transferred for medical care. They were being kidnapped again." Giuseppe raised his hand, speaking in his thick accent. "I saw Lieutenant Bradley take money from the Russian man with silver hair right outside my store, day before Frank was killed. Envelope thick like a brick." One by one, neighbors began sharing what they'd witnessed but hadn't understood until now. Strange cars with out-of-state plates. Men in suits who didn't belong in working-class neighborhoods. Young women who disappeared and reappeared looking traumatized and afraid. Tommy Rodriguez stood up, pulling out his phone. "I got pictures of that meeting Mr. Moretti talked about. Time-stamped from Tuesday afternoon." Father Russo realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A community connecting isolated observations into a comprehensive understanding of the conspiracy that had been operating under their noses. "This isn't just about Mike Tyson," the priest said. "This is about whether we're going to let criminals and corrupt officials destroy our neighborhood, or whether we're going to stand up and fight back." The room fell silent as people processed the implications of resistance. Fighting back meant risking retaliation from people who'd already demonstrated they would murder police officers and kidnap innocent women. Anthony Moretti broke the silence. "What do you need us to do, Father?" The question transformed the gathering from passive victims into active resistance fighters. Father Russo outlined a plan that used the community's greatest strength, their intimate knowledge of the neighborhood, and their ability to observe everything without being noticed. Giuseppe would coordinate intelligence gathering through his network of small business owners. Mrs. Washington would organize communication among elderly residents who were home during the day and saw everything that happened on their blocks. Tommy and the younger men would establish surveillance networks using social media and cell phone cameras to document suspicious activities. Mothers would organize safe houses and protection for potential victims. "We're not vigilantes," Father Russo emphasized. "We're citizens exercising our right to document crimes and protect our families when the official system fails us." As the meeting progressed, Mike listened from the basement, hearing his neighbors transform from frightened individuals into a coordinated resistance network. The most moving moment came when Mrs. Washington addressed the group directly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I've seen good times and bad times, but I've never seen our community stand together like this. Whatever happens, we're not backing down." The meeting ended with everyone understanding their specific roles in the fight ahead. As people filed out, they moved with the quiet confidence of those who'd found purpose in collective action. Father Russo returned to the basement where Mike had been listening through the heating vents. "How does it feel to have an army?" the priest asked. Mike looked up from the evidence files he'd been organizing. "Like something I should have built years ago." Through the basement windows, they could see neighbors walking home in small groups, talking quietly but moving with more determination than they'd shown in months. The community had officially declared war on Viktor Petrov and everything he represented. Becky Martinez arrived at St. Anthony's Church through the rear entrance at 10 p.m., moving carefully through shadows to avoid the police patrols that had been circling the building all day. She carried a small backpack containing the most important evidence in the entire investigation: her father's real files that in Father Russo's private office. Mike waited with carefully organized stacks of documents, photographs, and witness statements. The basement had been transformed into a command center that would have impressed any professional investigative team. "I have something Victor doesn't know I have," Becky said, producing a small flash drive from her backpack. My father's real files, the ones he hid before he died. Father Russo's computer hummed to life as Becky connected the drive. What appeared on screen was 3 years of meticulous detective work that Victor had thought was destroyed with Frank Castellano's murder. Detective Rafael Martinez had documented everything. Recorded conversations with trafficking victims, financial transactions showing payoffs to city officials, and photographic evidence of Victor's entire operation. Most damning of all were audio recordings of Victor directly threatening Martinez and discussing the detective's planned assassination. My father was working with FBI agent Patricia Chun, Becky explained, scrolling through encrypted communication files. She's been continuing his investigation unofficially, but needed this evidence to make arrests. Mike studied the financial records showing payments from Victor's shell companies to politicians, judges, and police officials. The corruption network was even more extensive than Frank had discovered, reaching into federal agencies and state government. There are also recordings of Victor threatening my father directly, Becky continued, playing an audio file that made Mike's blood run cold. Victor's voice was calm and conversational as he explained to Detective Martinez exactly how his family would be tortured if the investigation continued. The casual description of violence against a 19-year-old college student was delivered like a weather report. He knew my father would never stop, Becky whispered, tears flowing as she listened to her father's voice responding with quiet courage. So he had him killed and made it look random. Father Russo organized the evidence methodically, combining Martinez's files with his own documentation and the community's witness statements. Together, they created a comprehensive presentation that exposed not just the trafficking operation, but the entire corruption network protecting it. The most powerful element was Martinez's final audio log, recorded just hours before his death. If something happens to me, know that Viktor Petrov is running the largest human trafficking operation Brooklyn has ever seen. He's protected by Councilman Bradley Hutchins, Lieutenant Warren Bradley, and at least 2 federal judges whose names are in my secure files. The girls aren't just being sold locally. This connects to networks in Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Mike worked through the night, using his criminal justice education to organize everything in a format that would be impossible for corrupt officials to dismiss or suppress. We need to get this to Agent Chun, Mike said. Becky nodded, pulling out a burner phone. My father set up secure communication protocols with her. If we use his codes, she'll know the evidence is legitimate. At 3 a.m., they made contact with FBI agent Patricia Chun, who agreed to a clandestine meeting in Queens. The conversation was brief but electric with possibility. If Martinez trusted you enough to leave you his files, Agent Chun told Becky, then maybe we can finally get justice. But Agent Chun warned them about the scope of the challenge ahead. Victor's frame-up of Mike has complicated everything. We need to clear his name while simultaneously exposing the conspiracy. That means coordinating federal raids with media exposure to prevent evidence from disappearing. As dawn approached, they'd assembled everything needed to destroy Victor's operation. 3 years of Detective Martinez's investigation, Father Russo's community documentation, witness statements from dozens of neighbors, and photographic evidence of current criminal activities. This is enough to bring down the entire network, Father Russo said. Looking at the comprehensive case they'd built, Mike studied the evidence one final time, knowing that once they released it, there would be no going back. Victor would unleash everything he had to destroy them. Then let's finish what Detective Martinez started, Mike said. The final battle would be fought not with fists, but with truth. The one weapon Viktor Petrov had never learned to defeat, the war room in an undisclosed Queens location buzzed with controlled energy at 6 p.m. as Mike, Becky, Father Russo, and FBI agent Patricia Chun coordinated the most important media strategy of their lives. Investigative journalist David Kellner from the Brooklyn Tribune sat surrounded by documents, his laptop screen reflecting the glow of impending revelation. Agent Chun, a sharp-faced woman in her early 40s, had spent 3 years building a federal case against Victor's trafficking network. Martinez's hidden files provided the final pieces she needed, but the evidence had to be released carefully to prevent suppression. We have one shot at this, Agent Chun explained, pointing to a timeline on the whiteboard. The moment this story breaks, Victor's people will try to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and spin counter-narratives. We need simultaneous release across multiple platforms. Kellner had been writing investigative pieces about missing women for months, frustrated by official indifference to obvious patterns. The Brooklyn Tribune goes online at midnight. I've got editors standing by to push this to the front page of every major news website simultaneously. The strategy was comprehensive and coordinated. Release the evidence through multiple channels at exactly the same time, preventing any single corrupt official from suppressing the story. Social media, traditional news outlets, federal law enforcement, and community networks would all activate simultaneously. Becky worked on organizing her father's audio recordings into a timeline that told the complete story of Victor's operation and its political protection. The most powerful element was Detective Martinez's final message, recorded knowing he might not survive to see justice. This isn't just about exposing Victor, Father Russo observed. This is about showing the world that communities can fight back when systems fail them. At 10 p.m., they made final preparations for the coordinated release. Agent Chun confirmed that federal task forces were positioned to execute simultaneous raids on Victor's remaining operations once the evidence became public. The headline Kellner had crafted would appear across dozens of websites within minutes. Boxing legend Mike Tyson framed by trafficking ring he exposed. Community unites to fight corruption. The beauty of this approach, Agent Chun explained, is that it's impossible to suppress. By the time Victor's people realize what's happening, the evidence will be replicated across hundreds of servers and thousands of social media accounts. At 11:45 p.m., they initiated the release sequence. Kellner's comprehensive article went live on the Tribune's website, complete with audio recordings, financial documents, and photographic evidence. Within minutes, social media accounts managed by community members began sharing the story with hashtags that immediately started trending. Mike watched the story spread in real time across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hashtag Justice for Mike and hashtag Stop Trafficking began trending nationally within the first hour, driven by the authentic outrage of ordinary people who recognized the truth when they saw it. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss. Audio recordings of Victor discussing murders, financial records showing systematic bribery, and witness testimony from dozens of community members created a narrative that even the most corrupt officials couldn't challenge. Television news crews were already mobilizing to Brooklyn, drawn by a story that combined celebrity drama with genuine social justice. The narrative was irresistible, a neighborhood hero framed by the criminals he'd been fighting, supported by a community that refused to abandon him. By 2 a.m., the story was leading news coverage across the country. Cable networks ran continuous coverage, interviewing neighbors who'd witnessed Victor's operation and law enforcement experts who confirmed the evidence's authenticity. The response was swift and overwhelming. Federal authorities announced they were reopening investigations into the trafficking network. Political leaders who'd previously ignored the missing women cases suddenly demanded immediate action. Corrupt officials began distancing themselves from Victor as quickly as possible, but the most satisfying response came from the community itself. Mrs. Washington appeared on morning news shows, speaking with quiet dignity about her neighborhood's fight against organized crime. Giuseppe Moretti's bodega became an unofficial media headquarters, with reporters interviewing residents who'd observed pieces of the conspiracy. Tommy Rodriguez's photographs of Lieutenant Bradley accepting bribes became evidence in federal corruption charges. Father Russo found himself speaking to national audiences about the role of faith communities in fighting injustice. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, public opinion had shifted completely. Mike Tyson was no longer viewed as a dangerous vigilante, but as a hero who'd been systematically framed by the criminals he'd exposed. Viktor Petrov's empire was crumbling under the weight of truth, and there was no amount of money or corruption that could stop it. The media storm had become a hurricane of justice that would reshape everything. Viktor Petrov's rage was a living thing, feeding on desperation and 3 years of careful planning destroyed in a single night. At 6 a.m. Sunday morning, he stood in his remaining hideout in Red Hook, studying surveillance photos of St. Anthony's Church while 12 heavily armed men waited for orders. The media storm had been devastating and complete. Every news channel was running stories about the trafficking ring, the corruption network, and Mike Tyson's heroic fight for justice. Federal agents were executing raids across 3 states, dismantling Victor's empire piece by piece. But Victor had survived 20 years in organized crime by understanding that when everything else failed, overwhelming violence remained an option. Konstantin Volkov will lead the assault team, Victor announced to the gathered enforcers. The older brother of Alexei was a veteran of Chechen conflicts, experienced in urban warfare and completely without conscience. His scarred face showed no emotion. As he studied architectural plans of the church, the community gathers for Sunday service at 10 a.m., Victor continued, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the chaos surrounding him. Every witness, every supporter, every person who helped that bastard champion will be in one location. The plan was elegant in its brutality. 12 professional killers would surround St. Anthony's during morning worship, when the entire community would be gathered in prayer. No witnesses would survive to testify against Victor's operations. Boris Antonov checked his automatic weapon with professional efficiency. What about police response? My remaining contacts in the department will ensure delayed response, Victor replied. By the time federal agents arrive, everyone inside will be dead, including Mike Tyson. At 8 a.m., Agent Patricia Chen's wiretap equipment picked up fragments of Victor's communications, enough to understand that an attack was planned, but not enough detail to prevent it. Her frantic calls to Mike went straight to voicemail. His burner phone's battery had died during the night. Agent Chen raced toward Brooklyn, coordinating federal response teams while trying to reach anyone connected to St. Anthony's Church. But Sunday morning traffic and bureaucratic protocols meant her team wouldn't arrive before Victor's deadline at 8:30 a.m. A different call finally reached Mike. Tommy Rodriguez had been walking his dog when he spotted the assault team positioning around the church perimeter. His terrified whisper carried clearly through Father Russo's landline. Mr. Tyson, there's at least 10 guys with guns surrounding the church. Military-type gear. They look like they're getting ready to attack. Mike felt ice-cold clarity settle over him. 90 minutes until Sunday service began. 50-plus community members who would be trapped inside when Victor's killers struck. Father Russo refused to cancel the service when Mike explained the threat. Running would only delay the inevitable, the priest said firmly. Victor won't stop until he eliminates everyone who can testify against him. Instead, they developed a defensive strategy that used the church's architecture to their advantage. The stone building had been constructed in 1924 with thick walls and limited entry points. The basement could serve as a protected evacuation area for families with children. Mrs. Washington and Giuseppe know every adult in this congregation, Father Russo said. We can coordinate defense without creating panic. Mike positioned himself in the choir loft with clear sight lines over the main sanctuary. Community members would take predetermined positions that appeared natural but provided cover and escape routes. 9:45 a.m. Families began arriving for Sunday service, unaware that they were walking into the most dangerous hour of their lives. Children clutched their parents' hands. Elderly couples moved slowly up the front steps, and teenagers checked their phones while waiting for service to begin. Victor's convoy was 3 blocks away, moving steadily towards St. Anthony's Church. As Father Russo prepared to begin what might be his final sermon, the battle for the soul of the neighborhood was about to begin. Father Russo's voice carried clearly through St. Anthony's sanctuary at 10:15 a.m. as he delivered his sermon to a congregation of 67 people who had no idea they were sitting in the middle of a battlefield. Courage, the priest said from his pulpit, is not the absence of fear. It is standing up for what's right despite being afraid. In the choir loft, Mike watched the main entrance while noting the positions of community members who'd been quietly briefed on emergency procedures. Mrs. Washington sat in her usual front pew, her sharp eyes monitoring the children scattered throughout the congregation. Giuseppe Moretti had positioned himself near the side door, ready to help coordinate evacuations. That Victor's assault began with surgical precision. Konstantin Volkov's team had surrounded the church at 10 a.m., cutting phone lines and jamming cell signals to prevent calls for help. At exactly 10:17, they moved to seal all exits while the main force prepared to storm through the front doors. Tommy Rodriguez, posted as an unofficial lookout, managed one warning signal before the attack began. A simple text message sent just before the signal jamming activated. Now, Father Russo smoothly transitioned from his sermon to evacuation procedures that sounded like spiritual guidance. Sometimes we must seek shelter in the basement of our faith, he said calmly, while the storms of evil rage above us. The congregation understood immediately. Families with young children began moving quietly toward the basement stairs while adults took positions behind stone pillars and wooden pews that could provide cover. The front doors exploded inward as Victor's assault team stormed the sanctuary. Constantine led 4 men through the main entrance, while his brother Boris brought 3 more through the side door. Their automatic weapons were designed for maximum intimidation and destruction in the confined space of the church. But Mike was already moving. From the choir loft, he dropped down behind the altar as gunfire erupted throughout the sanctuary. His priority was protecting civilians, not engaging in direct combat. Every movement was calculated to draw fire away from families who were evacuating to the basement. Giuseppe Moretti and Anthony proved their courage by helping elderly congregants reach safety while bullets splintered wooden pews around them. Mrs. Washington, despite her age, coordinated the protection of children with the efficiency of a battlefield commander. Mike used the church's architecture brilliantly, moving between stone pillars that absorbed automatic weapons fire while he systematically targeted Victor's men. His first opponent was Boris Ananov, who made the mistake of pursuing him behind the altar. Mike's uppercut lifted Boris completely off his feet, sending him crashing into the brass cross with enough force to bend metal. The Russian crumpled, unconscious, his weapon skittering across marble floors. 2 more enforcers tried to pin Mike down with crossfire, but he used the raised pulpit and communion rail for cover while closing distance. His left hook dropped the first man instantly. A devastating right cross put the second man down permanently. Father Russo had refused to flee with the other civilians, instead helping coordinate the defense while using his own military training to direct families toward safety. Keep moving. Toward the basement, he called out over the gunfire. Don't stop until everyone's safe. But Victor had prepared for determined resistance. As Mike cleared the main sanctuary of most attackers, Victor himself appeared with his core team, dragging Giuseppe Moretti and Mrs. Washington as human shields. "End this now, champion," Victor called out, his voice echoing through the bullet-scarred sanctuary. "Surrender, or these good people die." Giuseppe's face was bloodied but defiant. Mrs. Washington looked directly at Mike with eyes that held no fear, only the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced down worse threats in her 82 years. Mike stood alone in the center aisle, surrounded by shattered pews and stained glass fragments, facing the moment that would define everything he'd fought for. Police sirens wailed in the distance. But Victor's remaining enforcers, Ivan Petrov, Dmitry Kozlov, and Konstantin himself, had positioned themselves strategically around the hostages. "Your choice, champion," Victor sneered. "Save these 2 old fools, or watch them die for your arrogance." Mike's response was to step forward, his hands raised in apparent surrender, while every muscle in his body prepared for the most important fight of his life. Victor Petrov stood near the altar of St. Anthony's Church, flanked by his 3 most dangerous enforcers, with Giuseppe Moretti and Mrs. Washington held at gunpoint. Sunlight streaming through bullet-shattered stained glass painted the sanctuary in fragments of color and shadow. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, champion," Victor said, his voice echoing through the damaged space. 3 years of careful planning destroyed by one washed-up fighter who couldn't mind his own business. Mike continued walking slowly up the center aisle, hands visible but ready. Behind Victor, he could see the basement door where Father Russo and the remaining congregation had taken shelter. Everyone was safe except the 2 people Victor held as his final bargaining chips. "Let them go," Mike said quietly. "This is between you and me." Konstantin Volkov tightened his grip on Mrs. Washington's arm, his scarred face showing no emotion as he pressed a pistol against her temple. Ivan Petrov held Giuseppe similarly, while Dmitry Kozlov kept his weapon trained on Mike. "The terms are simple," Victor announced. "You surrender and accept responsibility for Detective Castellano's murder. Confess to being a delusional vigilante who lost touch with reality. Do this, and these 2 die quickly instead of slowly." Mrs. Washington looked directly at Mike, her voice clear and strong despite the gun at her head. "Don't you dare give up. Young man, some things are worth fighting for, no matter what it costs. Giuseppe nodded weakly, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. My grandsons, they need to see what a real man does when evil threatens his family. Victor's mask of sophisticated control finally slipped, revealing the monster beneath. Touching sentiment. But sentiment doesn't stop bullets. That's when Mike made his move. He'd been studying the positions, angles, and reflexes of Victor's men while appearing to negotiate. When Victor gestured dismissively with his gun hand, Mike explosively closed the distance between them. The fight that followed would be talked about in Brooklyn for generations. Mike's first target was Dimitri, whose weapon posed the greatest immediate threat. A devastating left hook sent Dimitri crashing into the wooden pews, his gun flying harmlessly away. The move was so fast that the other enforcers barely had time to react. Constantine tried to use Mrs. Washington as a shield while shooting, but the elderly woman proved she still had fight left. She bit down hard on his gun hand, giving Mike the opening he needed to deliver his signature uppercut. The punch lifted Constantine 3 feet off the ground, his body arcing through the air before crashing into the altar rail with a sound like breaking timber. He lay motionless among scattered hymnals and brass candlesticks. Ivan Petrov released Giuseppe and tried to flee toward the side door, but Mike's pursuit was relentless. A combination of punches, left hook to the body, right cross to the jaw, finishing uppercut, dropped Victor's cousin like a fallen tree. Now only Victor remained, backed against the altar where Father Russo conducted Sunday services, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit torn. You think this changes anything? Victor snarled, producing a pistol from inside his jacket. Kill me, and 10 more will take my place. This is bigger than one operation, bigger than Brooklyn. Maybe, Mike replied, continuing to close distance. Despite the gun, but you won't be around to see it. Victor fired twice, but Mike's boxing footwork carried him sideways as bullets sparked off marble walls. Before Victor could fire again, Mike was within striking range. The final punch was poetry in motion, a perfectly timed uppercut that channeled 30 years of training, 20 years of experience, and a lifetime of standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. Victor's feet left the ground as the punch connected, his body lifting impossibly high before crashing down among the scattered remains of his criminal empire. Federal agents stormed through the church doors just as Victor hit the floor, unconscious and defeated. Agent Patricia Chun led the team, her weapon drawn but no longer needed. It's over, she announced, surveying the scene of unconscious criminals and grateful survivors. Mrs. Washington smoothed her dress and helped Giuseppe to his feet, both of them moving with the careful dignity of people who'd survived something terrible and emerged victorious. No, Mike said quietly, looking around the sanctuary where his community had fought and won against impossible odds. Now it begins. The nightmare was finally over, but the real work of rebuilding and healing was just starting. 6 months later, Mike Tyson walked the same Brooklyn streets where his story had begun, but everything had changed in ways both visible and profound. The morning sun cast warm light on freshly painted storefronts, clean sidewalks, and residents who moved with the confidence of people who'd reclaimed their neighborhood. The trials had concluded with decisive victories for justice. Victor Petrov received life imprisonment without possibility of parole for human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy charges. Councilman Bradley Hutchins was serving 20 years in federal prison for corruption and accessory to murder. Lieutenant Warren Bradley had been sentenced to 15 years for his role in Detective Martinez's assassination. The trafficking network had been completely dismantled, with federal oversight ensuring that similar operations couldn't take root. Again, over 40 victims had been rescued and provided with comprehensive support services, including counseling, job training, and legal assistance. Giuseppe's bodega had expanded into a community resource center, with expanded space for neighborhood meetings and social services. The walls were covered with photographs celebrating the community's victory over organized crime, including images of the Sunday morning when ordinary citizens had stood up to professional killers. Mrs. Eleanor Washington had become something of a celebrity, appearing on national television programs to discuss community-based crime prevention. At 83, she now led a neighborhood watch program that served as a model for urban communities across the country. Tommy Rodriguez was attending Brooklyn College on a full scholarship funded by donations to the Detective Rafael Martinez Foundation for Community Justice. The foundation, established in the murdered detective's honor, provided educational opportunities for young people and resources for families affected by crime. But the most significant change was evident at the Detective Martinez Community Safety Center, where Mike found himself every morning at 10 a.m. The renovated building had been funded by private donations from around the world, inspired by the story of a community that refused to accept injustice. Father Anthony Russo's church had become a model for faith-based community action, hosting conferences for religious leaders who wanted to learn how to organize effective resistance to local crime and corruption. The basement gymnasium where the resistance had been born was now a permanent training facility. As Mike approached the Safety Center's grand opening ceremony, he saw Becky Martinez cutting the ribbon while cameras captured the moment for history. She'd completed her first year of law school with perfect grades while working part-time as a victims advocate, specializing in trafficking cases. "My father would be proud of what we built here," Becky said as she embraced Mike warmly. She wore a simple black dress and her father's police academy graduation pin, symbols of both grief and determination. The community center featured state-of-the-art training facilities, counseling services, legal aid resources, and educational programs. But more importantly, it served as tangible proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they stood together. Mike looked around at the thriving neighborhood filled with families who no longer lived in fear. Children played safely in streets once controlled by criminals. Elderly residents sat comfortably on stoops, enjoying afternoon sun without watching for threats. Small businesses operated openly, no longer paying protection money to organized crime. The transformation went deeper than physical improvements. The community had discovered its own strength, its capacity for collective action, and its ability to protect the most vulnerable members of society. As the ceremony concluded and crowds began to disperse, Mike walked toward the community center's gymnasium, where a new group of young people waited for their first self-defense lesson. The class included teenagers who'd never heard of Viktor Petrov, children who'd grown up in a safe neighborhood, and adults who wanted to learn the skills that had saved their community. "Welcome to your first lesson in self-defense," Mike began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legendary. "But before we talk about fighting techniques, we need to understand what we're really protecting." He gestured toward the windows that looked out on the bustling, safe streets of their neighborhood. "We're not just learning to protect ourselves. We're learning to protect each other, to stand up for people who can't defend themselves, and to make sure that what happened here never happens again." As Mike began teaching basic defensive techniques to eager students, he understood that his greatest victory hadn't been won in any boxing ring or even in the final confrontation with Viktor Petrov. His greatest victory was right here, in this room full of young people learning that courage and community could overcome any threat, no matter how powerful or well-connected. The legend of Mike Tyson had found its true purpose, passing on not just fighting techniques, but the values of courage, community, and standing up for those who needed a champion most. Outside, the Brooklyn afternoon was alive with the sounds of children playing, neighbors talking, and ordinary life proceeding safely and peacefully. It was the sound of victory that would last forever. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.